Chapter 6, Two Guys in Their Underwear. The most important milestone in my early career was meeting Jack Burns at WEZE in Boston in 1959. After the Air Force and I parted ways, I continued as a DJ at KJOE back in Shreveport for a few months. But I wanted to be nearer New York and in a larger market, and when one of the guys from KJOE moved up to Boston, I asked him to get me a spot there no matter what kind of station it was. WEZE was a far cry from KJOE, an NBC network station. They still carried soap operas, quiz shows, and other antiquated programs. I got on the air as a board announcer, doing live copy and running the board when network came in. I did have a 2-hour music stint late at night, but I had to play shit like Sinatra, Victor Moan, Keely Smith, and Louis Prima. Jack was a newsman at the station. He and I hit it off immediately. We both did much the same Irish street character, who later became my Indian sergeant and all the other sergeants he spawned. Jack's version was a Boston Irish bigot who later became famous in his classic taxi cab routine with Avery Schreiber. Jack's guy had more of an edge. My guy had a more human side to him. These two guys would talk together for hours. They were great characters for saying things you weren't quite willing to say yourself. Jack and I found ourselves being very inventive in each other's company. We thought fast on our feet and struck up a great friendship. Even dreamed a little bit about doing a comedy act. Then, as usual, I got canned. I caused 2 major crises at WEZE. The first was the Cardinal Cushing Rosary incident. In 1959, Cardinal Cushing was a big deal in the Catholic Church, and being very close to the Kennedys, an even bigger deal in Boston. Every evening from 6:45 to 7, he said the Rosary on the air and was a long-time favorite with the Catholic Irish faithful. So I'm riding the board, and Cardinal Cushing is in his palace or wherever the fuck they live. He's on remote, a phone line. This evening he's doing the 5 sorrowful mysteries. Before he began the Rosary, he would always say a little something about life in the Boston Archdiocese. This evening he starts in about the Little Sisters of the Poor. The Little Sisters of the Poor have been working selflessly for years in the Boston wards where children with chronic diseases. He gets carried away by the wonderful saintly Little Sisters and starts the 5 sorrowful mysteries late. Now 7 o'clock is creeping up, and His Eminence is only at the 3rd sorrowful mystery, the crowning of our Lord with thorns, for those of you who care. I'm faced with a major executive decision. At precisely 7 o'clock, an Alka-Seltzer-sponsored newscast is due from the network. Alka-Seltzer and NBC versus Cardinal Cushing and the last 2 sorrowful mysteries. A no-brainer. I lower the Cardinal's pot. He's off the air. The news comes on with that little NBC jingle. Not a minute goes by before the phone rings and I hear a voice of thunder. I'd like to speak with the young man who turned the holy word of God off the air. Apparently he had a fucking air check monitor in his ear and he'd heard NBC News coming in. I said, Cardinal Cushing, this is George Carlin. I'm on duty. I have a log to follow, and the FCC... You know how you go for everything in a crisis situation. This is a federal communications regulation I have to follow. The station backed me up, but it was a huge black mark. Crisis number 2, the news unit incident, was even huger and blacker. Several times on weekends, when I needed to score pot, I'd taken the station's mobile news unit, a vast boat of a station wagon, stuffed with equipment and gaudy lettering along the side, reading WEZE 1260, News of the Moment, and driven it to New York. This particular weekend, there were about 6 or 7 of us, crowded in with the equipment, driving through Harlem looking to score. all over the city in a huge fucking car with huge fucking letters trying to score illegal drugs. Great PR for NBC News. When I get home, there's a call from the station manager in Boston. He says, "Guess what? We got a prison break at Walpole State Prison. Started last night. We couldn't find the news unit. I assume you have it." "Yeah, I got it. It's fine." "Well, it's not doing us any good down there in New York." I said, "They have a shitload of prison breaks at Walpole. There'll be another within a month. Don't sweat it." He didn't appreciate that. Sayonara, George. KXOL, the #1 station in Fort Worth, took me in and gave me a great spot, the 7 to midnight segment doing Top 40. The homework shift, they called it. Kids doing their homework and listening to the #1 station playing all the cool records. Before long, I got to be a bit of a local celeb, so I had a lot of contact with those kids, and for the first time I got a whiff of that unnamed, unspoken, unformed conspiracy of the young against authority and old rules that seemed to be fermenting in the heartland, in Fort Worth of all places. Cowtown and proud of it. Then after about 6 months at KXOL, who comes floating in the door one day but Jack Burns? He'd quit WEZE while doing the early morning news with a massive hangover. The station was in the old Statler Hotel, which had long windows like the Today Show does now, through which the public could peer in and be part of the exciting world of radio. Like newsman Jack Burns doing the early morning news. In the middle of reading the headlines, Jack looks up to see an old wino pissing on the window right in front of him. If there were no glass, he'd be pissing on Jack. And Jack thought to himself, "I do not want to be pissed on while delivering important news of the day," and quit. Now he's on his way to Hollywood, but he's broke and his tires are bald, and he's taken a detour to Cowtown to see if I could find him work. In more ways than one, it was something that was meant to be. A guy had just quit our newsroom without notice, and they were looking for a newsman. Authoritative, knowledgeable newsman Jack got the job on the spot. We picked up right where we'd left off, as did our Irish alter egos, and started rooming together. And Jack resumed his steady radicalization of me that had begun in Boston. In my home, republicanism was a given. Both my mother and aunt had worked for William Randolph Hearst and were terminally infected with the Westbrook Pegler, J. Edgar Hoover, Joe McCarthy virus. My mother was always happy to proclaim that while her dad had been a lifelong Democrat, she'd become an Eisenhower Republican. Then there was McCarthy. Because of what I'd absorbed at home, I was very pro-Joe. Of course there were communists everywhere, and if you were commies, wouldn't you try to get into the State Department? Those feelings, rather than opinions, weren't really part of my overall personhood. My mother had simply grafted them onto the personality of an outsider and rebel. At WEZE, I still had that conservative graft. It would come out on air sometimes. On one particular occasion, Jack called me on it. I can't remember why I did this on an easy listening station in an ultra-liberal town. Some news event must have provoked it. But right in the middle of the Manavani-style music mush, I issued a call for the preemptive bombing of Red China. When I came off the air, Jack was waiting for me. He said, "How the hell did you work nuking China into an intro for Andre Castellanets?" I had no idea what he was talking about. It seemed normal enough to me. Jack said, "Let's go get a beer. There's some things I got to talk to you about." From Jack, I heard a very different slant than the one I'd grown up with. That the right was interested in things, but the left was interested in people. That the right defends property and property rights while the left fights for civil and human rights. I began to realize the error of what had been handed to me through the Catholics, the Irish, my mother, through the Hearst legacy in our family. It didn't take much reasoning. It immediately struck a chord. Of course that's how I feel. Of course I'm for the underdog. Of course it's right-wing business assholes who've been keeping me down. The first time those doors opened for me was thanks to Jack. We started going to a coffee house called The Cellar on Houston Street, where you could get drinks even though Fort Worth was dry. In white Protestant Texas Cowtown, a bunch of beatniks at an all-night coffee house with illegal alcohol was really living on the edge. There was one guy there who wore a blanket and an eagle on his shoulder. A fucking eagle! These were Cowtown's outcasts. That was attractive somehow. All food for these new feelings. One night we got up and started riffing on the bits we'd played around with at home, letting our Irish guys talk, improvising on the floor. We heard laughs, amazing, real laughs. And that was the beginning, the genesis of everything that came afterwards. The first time I ever stood up in front of an audience of complete strangers and intentionally made them laugh. There is nothing like that feeling. Nothing. Nearly half a century later, it's still as powerful as ever. We continued to get up at the Cellar and continued to get laughs and a great deal more confidence. Some of it was because we were local favorites from the radio, but we were also doing these things with great abandon. The Cellar was our gymnasium, our laboratory. It belonged to us. Something else happened during that period that had a nice, wistful, romantic flavor. We would watch the Jack Paar Show, where dreams are made, and be full of fantasies about appearing on it. We'd sit around in our underwear. It was very hot in Texas, so we'd always be sitting around in our underwear, and improv getting on Par. One would play Par, the other Burns or Carlin. So tell us, guys, that soft, serpentine hiss Par had, how did you two get together? Well, I was dating Jack's mother. She's black, by the way. So I'm going down on her one night, and Jack walks in. We decided we had to leave Fort Worth. We bought a Dodge Dart, real good-looking, two-door light blue car, tinted windows and everything. We just got in the car and drove west on old Highway 80 toward El Paso. Mike Ambrose, the midnight guy who went on after my shift was over, kept saying goodbye to us as we drove out of the signal's reach, talking to us on the air. They're on their way to Hollywood. They're going to be big stars. Then he played El Paso by Marty Robbins. Just a wonderful feeling. What I remember most about the ambience of Hollywood was this amazing morning feeling, this promise of wide-open possibility, something about the way the air smelled. And it tasted good. And no, this is not a smog joke. There was a goldenness to the atmosphere. Even with all the traffic, there was a kind of quiet, a peace free of hustle and agitation. You felt safe, but at the same time able to have a different dream every day, or picture 100 futures. The reality was that we checked into the YMCA and immediately hit places like Villa Capri, hoping Frank Sinatra would come in, or that someone would say, "Look at those two interesting young men at the bar. Shouldn't they be in show business?" We had some money saved, so we bought suits at Sears, cool, rat-packy, 3-button deals, the kind of suits that in one light look green and in a different light look brown. So it's like having two suits. We hit the Brown Derby on Vine Street. Going in, we met Rock Hudson coming out. My first realization that everything is not what you're led to believe in the fan magazines. Rock was so light in his loafers, he barely touched the sidewalk. We continue this way for about a month and come back one day to the YMCA to find the remainder of our money missing from the sock drawer. We'd been robbed, presumably by some young Christian man. Disaster. We had to get some dough, get work, but unfortunately, we'd made a mutual pact not to ever really work. We would not park cars or wait tables. It was show business or starve. We had to get back into radio. Like I said, we weren't going to work. The first place we went, a daytime station called K-Day, was looking for a morning comedy team. Only in Hollywood. We did an audition tape and got the gig. They called us the Wright brothers, put aviator helmets on us, and we did our first show from an airplane. The studios, in a little building on Vine, didn't occupy the entire floor. There were also small offices with song publishers, song pluggers, or other small offshoots of show business could have an address or get phone messages. The station went off the air at sunset. Jack and I used to stay at the station and work on nightclub bits there. One night, we're rehearsing, and a guy come out of those little offices. His name was Mary Becker. Mary watched us for a while, then said, "I used to manage Rowan and Martin, and Ford and Hines. I know a lot of the teams. I know agents. I got connections. I worked with a lot of comics. You guys are nice. You're hip. You're young. You're clean. You got that hip tip. It's in. It's hip. Why don't you let me manage you?" Well, why not? Two things now happen. First, Mary knows a guy at Era Records, Herb Newman, and he gets Herb Newman to record us. $300 advance, but we're only in L.A. for a month, and we've recorded an album. Second, an important part of our act was an imitation of Mort Saul and one of Lenny Bruce. I did them both because I was a better mimic than Jack, and to imitate them in 1960 was something of an act of defiance. So we felt far out. That was the term of the time. These guys are really far out. They do Lenny and Mort Saul. Mary says, "I know Milt Evans, Mort Saul's manager. I know Lenny Bruce. We were in the Navy together. I think I can get them to come in and see you guys, and we can get a blurb or something. We get a little talk going. You guys are young, you're sharp, you're hot, you're hip." So Mort came in to see us. Mort was encouraging. He called us a cerebral duo, and later he recommended us to Hugh Hefner for the Playboy Club. They called us a duo of hip wits. A few nights later, in comes Lenny with his wife, Honey, and while we didn't quite realize at the time the legendary nature of this encounter, I do remember that, for evening wear, Lenny had chosen a powder blue sports jacket. Lenny was incredibly important to me. I'd come across his album, Interviews of Our Time, when I was in Shreveport, and I was changed forever. The defiance inherent in that material, the brilliance of the mimicry, the intellect at work, the freedom he had. I had no sense I could approach it ever, but I wanted to emulate it in any way I could. One simple way, mimic him. I got aspects of him that were very good, although I didn't really have the voice. But he liked us. He was partly flattered, I think, and partly liked the brash edge we had. So he was friendly and wished us luck. Emis. The next thing we know, we got a telegram from Jack Sobel, the head of GAC, which was one of the biggest agencies of the day. General artists, we handle everybody. The telegram read, "Based on Lenny Bruce's rave reaction, New York office hereby authorizes West Coast office GAC to sign Burns and Carlin under exclusive representation contract. All fields. Jack Sobel." Whew. It was June 1960. We'd been in the business 5 months. We had an album, a manager, and a big agency, and Lenny Bruce liked us. L.A. seemed to have delivered big time on that morning feeling. We got booked into a legitimate nightclub, the Cloister Inn in Chicago, a first-line place that was regularly reviewed by Variety. We do great. We get held over. Hefner sees us. Hefner likes us. We're in the Playboy Club, and Playboy at that time was on its way up, the polite side of the revolution, if you like, fighting for sexual freedom and freedom of speech. The guys who bought keys were actually kind of lame. They only thought they were hip because Hef told them they were. But still, it felt good to be in that mix. And we got the Parr Show, just 10 months after we'd been sitting in our underwear in Fort Worth fantasizing about it. We did Huntley and Brinkley interviewing Kennedy and Nixon. I did Nixon in 1960. Before anyone, I think. And I did Kennedy better than Vaughn Meader. Ha! We didn't get Parr as host. We got Arlene Francis. So we didn't get to tell our story about our having met when Jack caught me going down on his African-American mother. But we did get to be part of the growing Kennedy power structure that night. Arthur Schlesinger, Jr. was also a guest. Burns and Carlin were on their way. Our goal, if we had one, was to be a crossover act, somewhere between the disrespectful, irreverent comedy of the coffee houses and the smart, sophisticated Blue Angel School. Shelley Berman, Mort Saul, Nichols and May had already accomplished this. Bob Newhart and Dick Gregory were beginning to. That was what we aspired to. But there was some other element to what we did, a certain amount of risk-taking. We weren't quite what was becoming a standard type. We weren't clean-cut campus bred. We were urban, rough-edged Irish kids, in nice suits with what seemed like a decent vocabulary and a bit of social conscience, but cut from a coarser cloth. And when we later auditioned live at the Blue Angel, which was a very big deal, besides being in my hometown, those sophisticated East Siders who fell off their chairs at Shelley and Morton, Nichols and May just stared at us. We had a veneer of hipness, even of daring, but we were more interested in playing characters, especially these lower-class Irish guys, than we were in making a statement. We let our comedy serve our politics rather than have our politics drive what we did and said. And the Irish characters were in charge. They did the writing. There was always the chance at any moment that one of these characters might say something unplanned and might say it in an uncontrollable, disturbing manner. Shock, not titillate. That's exciting, the high wire stuff. These guys came from deep in our street experience. They were cops, dads, bartenders with baseball bats. The first-line authority figures we'd grown up with, as opposed to Congress, big corporations, and more impersonal authorities. Putting bigoted or violent language in their mouths was fun and funny, and even to a degree satirical, exposing them for what they were. In a way, they were the forerunners of later mainstream Irish bigots, like Peter Boyle's Joe and Carol O'Connor's Archie Bunker. Later still, throughout the 80s, my Irish street guy was a powerful element in the evolution of what finally became, in the early 90s, my authentic voice. He and his white Harlem relatives are the core of the family of characters that still live inside me. For the next 2 years, Jack and I played first-line nightclubs like the Embers in Indianapolis, Freddy's in Minneapolis, the Tidelands in Houston. Bill Brennan, the owner of the Racket Club in Dayton, flew into Chicago to see us and booked us for the next month. The Racket Club was a hugely important booking. Not professionally. After all, this was fucking Dayton, Ohio. But it was where I met my wife, Brenda. Deep down, I didn't want to work. I was lazy because I knew I was going to be a single at some point. Jack and I being together was just a stepping stone. I had no idea what the timing would be, but I knew it was inevitable. We developed a show of solid stuff and a second show for when those fucking people in the front tables wouldn't leave. But once we had that under our belts, we essentially coasted. We broke up in March 1962. Or I broke us up. It was at the Maryland Hotel in Chicago, where we'd had our first big booking. Jack seemed a bit stunned at first, but I think subconsciously he'd known for a while it was coming. We got pretty stoned and were clowning around, and for some reason that seemed funny at the time, Jack threw this paperback out the window into the freezing night. As he did, he suddenly realized all his pay was in the book. He'd put it there for safekeeping. We ran to the window and watched the 20s and 50s floating down through the snow, and we both knew that by the time we got to the street it'd all be long gone. So we split my half. Jack joined the Compass Players in St. Louis. He auditioned with another hopeful named Alan Alda. Both of them made it in, and then moved to Second City, where he later formed a comedy team with Avery Schreiber that did far better than Burns and Carlin. He ended up as a hugely successful TV writer and producer. We've stayed the best of friends. A few years ago, Jack said that without Burns and Carlin, he would have been working at the A&P as a stock boy for the rest of his life. Maybe. And quite possibly without Jack, I would have ended up as some dopey old radio cocksucker spewing bigotry into the night.